Heading into a pivotal election year, we're joined today by influencers from both sides of the aisle to discuss how this could affect financial advisors. I'm joined today by David Plouffe, Karl Rove. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. So Karl, as we look ahead to this pivotal year, what can we expect and what should advisors be concerned about?
Well, it's going to be a close election in all likelihood, assuming that Donald Trump is not the Republican nominee. But there is underneath this all, on both the left and the right, some strains of populism coming to the surface. And it's affecting both parties' primaries. And it will not go away when the parties are resolved in favor of the non-populist candidates. So there's going to be a continuing disquietude on both the left and the right about Wall Street that's going to be seen in American politics for the near term.
So when we think about what this means for advisors, David, how could this really impact them as we go forward?
Well, I agree with Karl. I think that populism is growing on both sides of the aisle. I think that, so you've got to understand that if you're in the advisory business or you're on Wall Street, I think you're going to see brickbats coming from both parties. I think generally the question is what happens after the election. And I think we all hope that there'll finally be some long-term budget deal that has some tax reform, has some infrastructure spending, deals with repatriation. Every year we wait, it gets harder and harder. So, but I think that's the big question, what happens after the election? And whoever wins, they'll have a year and a half where they have a chance to maybe get some big stuff done.
You think about, you mentioned Trump already, how is he going to impact things going forward? Should we be nervous at this point?
Well, I don't think he becomes a nominee because he has a high floor and a low ceiling, but he'll drive the debate in many ways, and he will be ultimately defeated because of it. But in the meantime, he can do real damage to our image abroad and real damage to American politics, because what he's going to unleash is going to be hard to put back. And what he's unleashing and what Bernie Sanders is tapping into, really, I agree with David, the next president is going to have a chance to solve some policy issues. But this sense of populism is rising up because people are anxious and concerned about the future of the country. Part of it is economic. People are saying, we've got foreign competitors. We are, is my skill going to allow me to continue to have a job that provides for the future? What about my kids? And a lot of this is among people who are, who don't have college education. For example, Trump's strength is almost entirely within people who have a high school education. And this is, if you step back from the politics in the moment, this is a disruptive economy for a lot of people in America, which raises the anxieties about trade and about Wall Street and about big business and about the future of our country itself.
So how long before we start to see this really shake out and see who the real candidates are that are going to kind of emerge here?
Yeah. On the Democratic side, look, I think it's fair to say it's going to be Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders is a nice bit of entertainment. He will upset her in one or two early states, may do it in New Hampshire. But on the Republican side, because of the nature of the party rules and the fact that we're beginning voting a month later than we have historically done for the last 20 years, we now vote the 1st of February as opposed to the 1st of January. And through March 14th, there'll be only one state that's allowed to have a winner-take-all primary. The other 27 states and jurisdictions will have proportional representation. This may take until the winner-take-all states begin voting on the Ides of March. And it may take until late April for the picture to be clear. And it could be like the Democrats in 2008 and go all the way to June before somebody actually has an actual majority of the delegates, because we don't have superdelegates, and those early 28 states can be chopped up between 4 or 5 different candidates.
What do you think?
Well, I agree with Karl first. I think Hillary Clinton has strengthened over the last 60 days, let's say. I think Bernie Sanders, he's doing surprisingly well. I don't think anybody thought he'd get 25–30% of the vote. He may even win a couple early states. What's interesting about the Republican race, I agree it'll go on for some time, and time's important in politics. So Karl and his team did a great job of defining John Kerry on their terms. We had some effect doing that to Mitt Romney in 2012. Bill Clinton actually did that to Bob Dole. So that's Clinton's advantage, is if she can pivot and kind of define the race herself and the Republican nominee, particularly if it's a Rubio. If you make it harder for Rubio to move a little bit to the center, that's really, really important. So I think Trump, A, he's going to elongate the race, and B, he probably makes it harder for some of these candidates, particularly a Rubio, maybe to run a more sensible race. So it'll be interesting to see if Clinton can take full advantage of what could be a 2 or 3 month window where she should be able to occupy some high ground.
Yeah, the difficulty is the rules are all changing. So for example, a super PAC I'm involved with, American Crossroads, is waiting for that moment It's assuming that the Republican contest goes on for some time and that she succeeds in consolidating the Democrats. So by April or May, she's in a place where if the Republican nominee begins to emerge but still doesn't have the nomination in hand and she comes after them, groups like Crossroads will be ready for that moment. And she won't have a free and clear path to define the election all by herself.
So what does this all mean for financial advisors? What are some big issues that they're concerned about, worried about, that are top of mind right now?
Well, I think the question is, I do think this is going to be a very populist race. I mean, maybe a little less so if a Rubio were to emerge, but clearly I agree with Karl. I think the Trump forces are going to be around for some time. You saw Hillary Clinton. I think some people are surprised that she may be running even to the left of President Obama on some of these issues. But I think the real question is what happens substantively after the election. You know, around issues like tax reform, around a long-term budget agreement, around some infrastructure spending. There's a deal to be had, I think. And I think the question is that going to be something that gets done in 2017? If it doesn't, it may not get done until the next decade, which just makes this all more difficult.
And one thing to pay attention to, and what they ought to be looking at, is what do the candidates say that might pin them into a bad place for after the election? For example, we saw one of the big issues, obviously, is what do you do about repatriation of foreign earnings? We are the only major industrial country that does not have a territorial tax system. And so if you're an American company and you sell a product in Germany and pay taxes on your profits there, you want to bring them home, you have to pay a second tax here. If you're a German company, you're Siemens, and you sell a piece of medical equipment here, you pay a U.S. tax, you can take those profits home. And for example, this populist sentiment is having an impact on this. Hillary Clinton is now talking about an exit tax. If you're an American company that realizes you're at a competitive disadvantage and you want to, in essence, sell yourself to a foreign company, in essence take over a foreign company, but then operate out of, say, Ireland, you'll have to pay an exit tax. Now, that sort of pins her in for when we get around to the question of tax reform. So particularly with the things that are going to have a big, significant impact on the American economy. The question is, what is populism on both sides doing to pin candidates into a place that's going to make it more difficult to get the right kind of an arrangement, right kind of a deal, right kind of legislation after the election?
So last question, David, for you. What can they learn from President Obama here as whoever the candidate may be eventually, to really clear the log jamming, get real things done?
Well, it's going to take, it's going to take some courage from enough members of both parties, because we're at a time right now when a Republican reaches out and wants to work with a Democrat on something, they get a deep amount of criticism for that. Same thing on the Democratic side. So first of all, it's going to take some courage. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, the truth is, Karl and I could probably sit here in an hour and we would have some big fights, but we generally could reach agreement. I mean, it's going to take people saying Democrats are going to have to be willing to make some concessions on some entitlement reforms. Republicans are going to have to make some concessions probably in tax reform, but there's a long-term deal to be had. And so the question is, if you're an optimist, you'd say maybe by the end of 2018, no matter who the president is, we finally get immigration reform done. We get a long-term budget deal done. Those two things would obviously, I think, provide some economic security and help with growth. I mean, even immigration is estimated to give up to, I believe, up to a point of GDP growth in the years after it. So that's really what it comes down to. But we're at a point right now where too many members of both parties are concerned about their primaries and their electoral future. Plenty of exceptions to that, by the way. Plenty, particularly in the Senate, people who are willing to work across party lines. But we just need more of that.
Mm-hmm. And which candidate can help us think long term, Karl?
Well, that's what we're going to learn. My suspicion is on the Republican side, there are 5 or 6 or 7. But look, David's right. Think about back to 2000 and 2001. Bush comes in a slightly more contentious way than most presidents come in, given the acrimony over Florida, and faces a Democratic Senate, but passes the Bush tax cuts by June with a quarter of the Democrats voting for it because Bush's people sat down and negotiated with the Democrats, particularly in the Senate, led by the Senate Finance Committee chairman from Montana, Max Baucus. And by the end of the year, we had no child left behind with John Boehner, the Republican, Judd Gregg, a Republican, George Miller, and Ted Kennedy, and it passes the Senate 96-3. But it was negotiation, people sitting in the room, working it out, trying to find areas of common agreement, and then making compromise on the things where they couldn't come to an agreement, and putting some issues aside and saying we're going to let this be decided on the floor. Whether it's going to be blue or green is going to be decided when we actually have a vote on the floor, because we can't come to an agreement or a compromise on it.
Well, it's interesting, just one last thing. So if you look at recently on TPP, the trade deal, a place where the president and congressional Republicans came together, but you see the populism in both parties is going to make, I think it's going to pass, but it's going to make it much more difficult. And I think a lot of it's not even on the substance. There's just this reflexive, and it's, you know, trade is bad, right? We're going to be wronged by that. And so this is an instance where exactly what we need is more people who are willing to compromise a little bit and put the nation's interest first. But it is going to be made harder. I wouldn't say necessarily it's going to be impossible, but it's going to be made harder by this growing populism.
Yeah. Don't expect a lot to be done between now and the election, because everybody's in their corners, and even if they want to do it, they feel constrained by the pressures of their caucus and the circumstances and the politics of the moment. So we'll have a few episodic moments. I'm hoping that the Pacific Partnership is one of them, but there's going to be very little done of a substantive measure between now and the election. And we ought to celebrate every time we do something substantive, and maybe it'll encourage them to do more substantive things after the election.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. Some great insights, and thank you for making some time for us today.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
For Investment News, I'm Matt Acker.